A white female police officer forcibly cuts the hair of a young black girl, completely unaware of who her father is. By the time she realizes the truth, it is already too late. She's forced to face one of the most dangerous criminals of all. The city held a certain kind of silence at this hour, the type that wasn't peaceful, but rather expectant, like the world was holding its breath. Rain clung to the air. Sophie Carter walked with measured steps, careful not to slip in her heels, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she held her concert program tightly to her chest. The adrenaline from the performance still thrummed in her veins, the echoes of applause ringing in her ears. This was supposed to be one of the best nights of her life. Her first solo at Madison Concert Hall, playing Chopin before a crowd that had risen to their feet by the final note. She had felt untouchable, as if the world had finally recognized her talent, as if everything she had worked for had finally meant something. And yet, here in the quiet of the city streets, where the glow of neon signs flickered and the distant hum of traffic was the only music left, a weight settled over her that she couldn't quite shake. She had been taught to stay alert, to always be aware of her surroundings, but tonight she just wanted to savor the moment. Her father's words still lingered in her mind. "This hair is your crown, baby girl. Ain't nobody taking that from you." He had spent the morning carefully parting and weaving her hair, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he worked each braid into place. It was a ritual, a tradition passed down through generations of their family, rooted in love, in history, in pride. Her hair was more than just hair. It was a piece of who she was, and then red and blue lights flooded the street. The siren wailed, sharp and piercing against the night, a sound that sent something cold curling in Sophie's stomach. A police cruiser rolled up beside her, its headlights beaming straight into her eyes. She froze, instinct tightening her grip on the concert program. The door swung open with a heavy creak, and out stepped a woman in uniform. Officer Selina Harper, middle-aged, with a stiff stance and narrowed eyes that moved over Sophie with the kind of slow, deliberate scrutiny that made her skin crawl. Sophie knew this look. She had seen it before. The way white women in department stores followed her down aisles she wasn't even shopping in. The way teachers raised their brows whenever she spoke too confidently in class. The way a security guard once asked to check her bag at a coffee shop while letting a white girl with a much larger backpack walk right past. "Where you headin' this late?" Selina's voice cut through the damp air, sharp and laced with something Sophie recognized immediately. Suspicion. Sophie swallowed, forcing her voice to stay even. "I just finished performing at Madison Concert Hall. I'm heading home. I live a few blocks away." Selina's gaze flickered to Sophie's hair, lingering just long enough for her meaning to be clear. "That right?" she said slowly, tilting her head. "You got ID on you?" Sophie hesitated, not because she didn't have it. She did, but because she knew where this was going. She had seen enough news stories, had heard enough warnings from her father, had sat through enough difficult conversations to recognize the script. She moved carefully, reaching into her purse, making sure her motions were slow, deliberate, so that there would be no excuse, no sudden movements, nothing to be misunderstood. "May I ask why?" she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. Selina's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You may not." Sophie pulled out her wallet, flipping it open to reveal her driver's license. She held it out, but Selina didn't take it. Instead, her eyes flicked to Sophie's purse. "Open it." Sophie's pulse quickened. "Excuse me?" Selina took a step closer, the weight of her presence suffocating. "I said, open it." Sophie hesitated. "Ma'am, I don't understand what—" That was all it took. Selina snatched the bag from her hands before she could react. Sophie gasped, instinctively stepping back, but Selina was already rifling through her belongings with a kind of rough impatience that made Sophie's stomach turn. Sheet music crumpled beneath the officer's grip. A tube of lip gloss rolled onto the wet pavement. A small case of earrings, her grandmother's, tumbled out, landing in a puddle. "Hey!" Sophie's voice wavered. "You got something to hide?" Selina asked, her tone mocking as she pulled out a folded piece of paper and flicked it open. Her eyes scanned it, but when all she saw was Sophie's concert schedule, her lips twisted into a sneer. She crumpled it and tossed it back into the bag. Sophie's nails dug into her palm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Selina exhaled sharply, shaking her head like she was disappointed. "You think I don't know what this is?" She waved a hand toward Sophie's head, voice thick with disdain. "These braids. I seen 'em before. Girls like you running around in the wrong parts of town, thinking you're something special. You're not fooling nobody." For a moment, Sophie couldn't breathe. The words slammed into her like a punch, knocking the air from her lungs. Not because they were new, she had heard them all before, but because standing here, under the glow of streetlights, with a badge and a gun in front of her, they weren't just words. They were power. "My hair," Sophie said, her voice low, steady despite the tremor in her hands, "has nothing to do with gangs." Selina scoffed. "Yeah? Then you won't mind coming with me to the station?" The world tilted. "No," Sophie said quickly, panic flaring in her chest. "I didn't do anything. You can't just—" Cold metal snapped around her wrists. The cuffs bit into her skin. The street spun. The wet pavement blurred beneath her feet. Rain clung to her lashes. Selina's grip was rough, unforgiving, absolute. "Let's go, sweetheart." Sophie's breath hitched, her whole body trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something primal. The station was colder than the night outside, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing softly, casting everything in a harsh, unnatural glare. The smell of stale coffee and damp uniforms clung to the air, mixing with something metallic, something Sophie couldn't quite place, but made her stomach twist. She sat on a hard metal chair, her wrists still cuffed in front of her, the steel biting into her damp skin. Her dress, once pristine, once a symbol of her achievement, now clung to her like a second skin, soaked through with rain and humiliation. Selina Harper stood a few feet away, leaning against the desk, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but not indifferent. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing in the way she held herself. As if everything that had happened, the stop, the search, the arrest, was nothing more than routine. To her, maybe it was. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. She would not cry. Across the room, a younger officer, Mike Lawson, hovered near the filing cabinets, pretending to be busy with paperwork. But Sophie could see it in his eyes, the flicker of unease, the way he kept glancing her way, as if something about this didn't sit right with him. He didn't speak up, though. None of them ever did. Selina exhaled sharply, pushing off the desk. She walked over to where Sophie sat and studied her the way someone might study a puzzle they didn't quite understand. "You want to tell me why you were out there, really?" she asked, voice low, controlled. "Because I don't buy the whole piano concert thing." Sophie looked up at her, her anger simmering just beneath the surface now, pressing against the edges of her restraint. "You think I'm lying?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Selina's lips curled. "I think you're hiding something." Sophie held her gaze. The only thing I was doing tonight was walking home. Selina scoffed, shaking her head. That's what they all say. Sophie's fingers clenched. They. She knew exactly what Selina meant. Before she could say anything, a different voice cut through the tension. Harper, Mike spoke up finally. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the two women. She's a student. Her record's clean. Maybe we should call her folks. Selina turned her head slowly, fixing him with a look that made the words die in his throat. Maybe, she said, her voice sharp. You should mind your own damn business. Mike hesitated but said nothing more. He lowered his gaze and went back to his files. Sophie felt something tighten in her chest. She turned her eyes back to Selina. You really think I don't belong here, don't you? She said softly. You saw my hair, saw my skin, and that was enough. Selina's expression darkened. You think you're special? She asked, voice colder now. You think you get to walk around dressed like that, wearing your hair like that, and I'm supposed to just assume you're some innocent little girl? Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears. Dressed like what? She demanded. With braids my father put in my hair, with a white dress I wore to play music. What about me, exactly, made you think I was a criminal? Selina leaned down, her presence suffocating. You really want to know, she murmured. 'Cause I've seen enough girls like you. Same hair, same attitude, same lies. Sophie flinched. Selina saw it, and something about that reaction seemed to fuel her. She straightened, tilting her head toward the door. Get the barber down here, she called out. Mike stiffened. Selina, come on. You got a problem, Lawson? Selina snapped. Mike hesitated, then shook his head and left the room. Sophie's breath caught. She knew what was coming. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as she fought to keep her expression blank. She would not break. Selina sat back on the desk, arms crossed, watching her. You got a real smart mouth, she mused. That's going to get you in trouble one day. Sophie said nothing. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and an older man stepped inside. George, the station's designated barber, carried a small black case in one hand. He looked tired, reluctant, like he didn't want to be here. His eyes flickered toward Sophie, and for a moment something passed between them, something like understanding. Harper? He said carefully. She's just a kid. Selina smirked. She's got gang ties. George's brow furrowed. He looked back at Sophie. She held his gaze, defiant, unwavering. George's hands tightened on the case. His shoulders sagged slightly. He turned to Selina. You sure about this? Selina didn't even blink. It's protocol. George hesitated for only a moment longer before sighing. He walked over to Sophie, setting the case down. He knelt beside her, his movements slow, measured. I'm sorry, he murmured. Sophie didn't respond. The sound of the clippers clicking on filled the room. Selina watched, her reflection caught in the small mirror on the opposite wall. For the first time all night, a flicker of something crossed her face, something that almost resembled doubt. But it was gone just as fast. She watched as the first braid fell, tumbling to the floor like a severed piece of Sophie's dignity. And still, Sophie did not cry. She would not give them that. She kept her eyes locked on Selina's through the mirror, her chin lifted, her gaze unbroken. Selina felt that look, felt the weight of it. And for the first time, she felt something shift inside her, something she wasn't ready to name. But it didn't stop her from turning away. Outside, the rain poured harder, slamming against the windows. and somewhere in the shadows beyond the station doors, a man in a black coat stood watching. His phone still recording. Morning came slow, heavy, pressing against the walls of the precinct like a storm waiting to break. The air was thick with the stale scent of burnt coffee, damp wool, and something else. Tension, quiet but suffocating. Captain Thomas Monroe moved through the station with the weight of a man who had seen too much, his heavy boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Conversations faded as he passed, officers suddenly finding something important on their desks, something worth looking at other than the dark clouds settling on his face. He didn't stop until he reached Selina Harper's desk. She was standing with a cup of coffee in hand, talking to Mike, her stance easy, relaxed, like she hadn't done anything out of the ordinary the night before. "Harper," Monroe's voice cut through the low hum of the office. "My office. Now." Selina arched a brow, but didn't move immediately. She wasn't the kind of cop who got rattled easy, especially not by a man like Monroe, the kind who carried his authority in silence, couldn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. "Something wrong, Cap?" she asked, taking a sip of coffee, unfazed. Monroe didn't answer, just tossed a file onto her desk. The name on the folder sent a slow, creeping unease through her gut. Sophie Carter. Selina frowned, flipping the file open, expecting to see a rap sheet, some kind of record, something that would justify everything that happened last night. What she found instead was a single line that made the coffee in her mouth turn bitter. Father, Nathan Carter. Selina didn't move for a long second. Didn't breathe. The name sat there, bold, undeniable, impossible. She looked up, but Monroe was already watching her, his eyes dark with something she had never seen directed at her before. Disgust. "You have any idea what you just did?" His voice was calm, but it wasn't a question. Selina's grip tightened around the folder. "She looked like a suspect," she said, the words coming out slower than she meant them to. Monroe exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "She looked like a suspect," he repeated, voice laced with something sharp. "That's what you're going with?" Selina straightened, her defenses rising fast. "I followed protocol." Monroe's hand slammed against the desk. Papers scattered. Conversations around the precinct stopped. "Protocol?" he hissed, leaning in. "That girl is the daughter of a federal agent currently working a classified case. You didn't just humiliate some innocent kid last night, Harper. You jeopardized a goddamn FBI operation." Selina went still. She had been on the force long enough to know Nathan Carter's name, knew what he was, what he did, what he was capable of. And she had just put his daughter in cuffs. Something cold settled in her stomach. Still, she refused to back down. "You're telling me," she said slowly, voice measured, "that some FBI agent's kid gets special treatment while the rest of us are out here trying to keep the streets clean?" Monroe let out a low, humorless laugh. "You still don't get it, do you?" His gaze bore into hers, unrelenting. "This ain't about the badge, Harper. This ain't about protocol. This is about you looking at a 17-year-old girl and deciding she was a criminal because of how she looked." Selina clenched her jaw. Before she could respond, the station doors swung open, and Nathan Carter walked in. The room turned cold. Nathan was the kind of man who didn't need to announce himself. His presence did it for him. Dressed in a dark suit, tie loose at the collar, he moved like someone who was used to being watched, used to being feared. He carried himself with the quiet, restrained intensity of a man who had spent years in dangerous places, doing dangerous things, and had come out sharper, harder. His eyes, cold as steel, swept across the precinct before landing on Selina. She didn't flinch, but something inside her wavered. He walked toward her slowly, methodically, stopping only when he was close enough for her to see the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. "You cut my daughter's hair," Nathan said. A statement, not a question. Selina forced herself to hold his gaze. "Don't," Nathan cut her off, voice calm, controlled, deadly. Selina shut her mouth. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was memorizing her, filing away everything about her, her stance, her breathing, the way her fingers twitched slightly at her side. Monroe cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Nathan, we can handle this internally." Nathan's eyes never left Selina. "I don't want apologies," he said, voice steady. "I don't want reports. I don't want your goddamn internal affairs to slap a suspension on her so she can come back in a few months like none of this ever happened." Monroe exhaled. "What do you want?" Nathan finally blinked, tilting his head slightly, considering. Then, slowly, a smile curled at the edges of his lips. But it wasn't warm. It was sharp, calculated. "I want her to fix her mistake," he said simply. The words hung in the air, thick and unyielding, as if the very walls of the precinct could feel the shift that had just taken place. Selina Harper had spent years in law enforcement, had stared down criminals in interrogation rooms, had walked through crime scenes without so much as a flinch. But standing there, locked in Nathan Carter's unwavering gaze, she felt something foreign, a rare and unwelcome sensation creeping beneath her skin. She had lost control. Nathan wasn't asking. He wasn't suggesting. He was telling her exactly what was going to happen. And for the first time in her career, Selina found herself with no way out. They met again later that night. A quiet bar on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where the jukebox hummed low and the smell of cheap whiskey lingered in the air. Nathan was already there when she arrived, sitting in a booth near the back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, never missing a thing. Selina slid into the seat across from him, her fingers drumming lightly against the worn wooden table. "So," she said, leaning back, "you gonna tell me what the hell this is about? Or are we just gonna sit here and pretend we don't hate each other?" Nathan smirked, but there was no humor in it. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim file, and slid it across the table. Selina hesitated only a second before flipping it open. Gene Hackman. The name alone was enough to send a sharp pulse of adrenaline through her veins. She had heard it whispered in precinct hallways, seen it scrawled across confidential reports. A name that carried weight, power, blood. Hackman had built his empire on fear, running weapons, drugs, and people with the kind of efficiency that made the FBI's job damn near impossible. He was untouchable, the kind of criminal that law enforcement either took down or worked for. "You want me to get close to him?" Selina said, her voice careful, measured. Nathan shook his head. "I want you to get close to his second-in-command, Victor Steele." Selina exhaled through her nose, flipping the page to a photograph of a man in his early 40s, dark eyes and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. She had never met him in person, but she had heard plenty. Steele was the executioner, the one who got his hands dirty while Hackman sat back and watched. "You want me to make him trust me," she said. Nathan's expression didn't change. "You said it yourself, Harper." You're good at pretending to be something you're not. Selina's jaw clenched, but she didn't argue, because she knew deep down this was the only way. She had made a mistake she couldn't take back. But maybe she could balance the scales, even if it meant walking straight into the fire. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching out longer than the last. The girl in the mirror wasn't the girl she had been 2 nights ago. That girl had stepped off a stage, full of pride, full of hope. This girl had been stripped down, humiliated, made to feel small in a way she never had before. Sophie reached up, running a hand over her hair, what was left of it, the uneven, choppy remains of her once proud braids. Her fingers curled into fists. She had 2 choices. She could let this break her, or she could take everything they had tried to steal and turn it into something powerful. She reached for the worn leather notebook on her desk, flipping it open to a blank page. Her hand shook only slightly as she picked up her pen. And then, slowly, she began to write. A melody, a message, a fight she could put into music. Resilience. Selina spent 2 weeks building her cover. It wasn't hard. Corrupt cops weren't exactly a rarity in Hackman's world. The trick wasn't convincing them she was dirty. It was convincing them she was useful. The first time she met Victor Steele, it was at an underground club in a part of town where the streetlights flickered and died before midnight. He was already watching her when she walked in, a drink in his hand, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "You're either real brave or real stupid showing up here," he said as she slid onto the bar stool beside him. Selina smiled, slow and practiced. "Can't I be both?" Victor chuckled, tilting his glass toward her in mock salute. But his eyes didn't hold laughter. "You got something to prove?" he asked. Selina took a sip of her drink, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I got something to offer." Victor leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something low, something dangerous. "Then let's see if you're worth my time." The warehouse was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, stretched too thin over the tension in the air. The cold metal walls seemed to close in around Selina Harper as she stood by the loading dock, hands buried deep in the pockets of her jacket, eyes scanning every movement around her with practiced ease. The shipment had arrived an hour ago, crates stacked neatly in rows, each one marked with numbers that meant nothing to the average observer, but everything to the people she was now surrounded by. Her heart was steady, her breathing even, but deep inside, she knew she was running out of time. For weeks, she had worked her way into Victor Steele's inner circle, proving herself through carefully calculated moves, playing the role of a cop who had finally had enough of the system and was looking for something more profitable. Steele had tested her at every turn, forcing her into situations where hesitation could mean the end of everything. She had taken every test, every risk, knowing there was no other choice. But no matter how convincing she had been, she could feel it. He still didn't trust her completely. And now, standing here, in the heart of Hackman's operation, she had finally found what she needed. Her body was still as she shifted just slightly, turning just enough to send a discreet signal through the wire hidden beneath her sleeve. It was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment the FBI would move in. But before she could take another breath, a voice cut through the air, low and edged with something dark. "Something wrong?" Selina turned slowly, already knowing who she would find standing behind her. Victor Steele was close, too close, the weight of his presence pressing against her skin like an unspoken threat. His dark eyes swept over her, searching, reading. and she knew in an instant that something had changed. He had seen something. He had felt something. And now she was caught. Her pulse didn't spike, her expression didn't waver, but she could feel the danger curling around her, like a noose, tightening with every second that passed. "Nah," she said, her voice even, careful. "Just making sure everything's smooth." Victor tilted his head slightly, watching her in a way that made her stomach turn. Then, without warning, his hand shot forward, fingers closing around her wrist like a steel trap. Before she could react, he yanked her arm up, pushing back the sleeve of her jacket, exposing the thin wire taped to her skin. For a second the world stopped. Then everything fell apart. Victor's grip tightened, his voice a low growl. "You really thought you could play us?" Selina moved. With a sharp twist, she wrenched herself free, slamming her elbow into his ribs with enough force to make him stumble. But Victor was fast. Too fast. He barely flinched before reaching for his gun. A single thought cut through Selina's mind. Run. She took off, boots pounding against the concrete as shouts erupted behind her. The sound of safeties clicking off, of bullets sliding into chambers. The exit was close, just a few yards away, but the moment she turned the corner, she came to a sudden stop. Gene Hackman stood in her path. Tall, composed, untouched by the chaos unfolding around him, he looked at her with something close to amusement, as if he had known this was coming all along. Selina's fingers twitched toward her weapon, but before she could reach for it, he shook his head slowly. "I knew from the start," he said, voice smooth, unbothered. "I just wanted to see how far you'd go." A muscle in Selina's jaw clenched. Behind her, footsteps pounded against the concrete, closing in fast. Victor's voice barked orders, his fury palpable. There was nowhere to run. And then the doors behind Hackman exploded open. Nathan Carter moved like a storm, gun drawn, eyes locked on Hackman as FBI agents flooded the warehouse, their voices cutting through the air like sirens before the actual sirens even had a chance to arrive. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the building, echoing against metal walls, drowning out the shouts of men scrambling for cover. Selina barely had time to react before Victor lunged at her, his fist swinging. She ducked, moving on instinct, feeling the air shift as his punch missed by inches. Before he could recover, she struck back, landing a blow to his ribs, but Victor was relentless. Nathan was already locked in a battle of his own, his movements sharp and precise, as he fought his way toward Hackman, his focus never wavering. Selina barely saw what happened next, just the flicker of movement, the glint of steel, the shift in Victor's stance as he pulled his gun. No time to think. No time to hesitate. She lunged forward, grabbed his wrist, and twisted with everything she had. The gun fired, a sharp, deafening sound, but the bullet went wide, embedding itself in a crate just inches from her head. She wrenched the weapon from his grasp, turned it on him, and for a split second, Victor Steele finally looked afraid. The hesitation cost him. A single gunshot rang out. Victor staggered, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. He blinked once, as if he hadn't quite processed what had happened, before his legs gave out beneath him. Selina didn't watch him fall. She turned just in time to see Nathan land the final blow. One swift, brutal move that sent Hackman crashing to the ground. The crime boss barely struggled as the cuffs were snapped onto his wrists, but when his eyes met Nathan's, he only smirked. "Busting me won't change a damn thing," Hackman murmured, voice low, almost amused. "I got people everywhere." Nathan didn't blink. Not anymore. The chaos began to settle, the warehouse now swarmed with agents securing the area. Selina, still catching her breath, felt the weight of the past few weeks crash down on her all at once. She turned, found Nathan watching her. For the first time since this had all begun, there was something different in his expression. Not just calculation, not just control, something almost like respect. "You did it," he said. Selina exhaled, her fingers aching, her body screaming from exhaustion. "I had to," she muttered. Nathan nodded once, understanding. The air inside the concert hall carried a kind of stillness that only came in the seconds before something remarkable unfolded. Sophie Carter sat before the grand piano, fingers lightly grazing the keys, her heartbeat steady, controlled, but charged with an energy that only she could feel. The stage lights cast a warm glow around her, illuminating the soft ivory of the instrument, the polished wood reflecting her poised expression. A year had passed since the night that had changed everything. A year since she had felt the weight of cold steel tightening around her wrists, since she had stood in front of a mirror and barely recognized herself in the reflection. A year since she had realized that some wounds did not heal with time alone, that some scars, though invisible, were carried beneath the skin, woven into the fabric of who she had become. She had spent months pouring everything she could not say into the composition she was about to play. Every measure, every note had been shaped by the pain of humiliation, the quiet rage of injustice, and the unrelenting need to reclaim something that had been stripped from her that night. This piece was not just music. It was a reckoning, a declaration, and above all else, a refusal to be silenced. She took a slow breath, exhaling as her hands pressed down on the first chords of Resilience. The sound drifted through the hall, delicate at first, almost hesitant, like the first fragile steps taken after a long fall. But as the melody grew, it deepened, surging forward with purpose, unraveling into something raw and untamed. The audience sat in silence, drawn in by the sheer power behind each carefully placed note, as if they could feel the history buried beneath the music. Among them, in the last row of the dimly lit theatre, Selina Harper sat motionless. She had not wanted to come. She had told herself she had no right to be here, that her presence would be nothing but an intrusion on a night that did not belong to her. And yet, when she had received the invitation, handwritten in careful, deliberate strokes, she had found herself unable to ignore it. So here she was, watching the girl whose life she had almost destroyed take control of a stage that had always belonged to her. The music pulled at something deep within Selina, something she had spent months trying to bury beneath the work she had thrown herself into. No badge, no authority, no weight of a department behind her to shield her from the choices she had made. The community center had become her world, a place where she could do something, anything, to atone for the damage she had caused. But sitting here, listening to this music, she realized that all the work she had done, all the time she had spent trying to be better, had never been about fixing herself. It had been about waiting to see if she would ever be forgiven. Sophie's eyes swept over the crowd, her expression unreadable, but for a brief moment, their gazes locked across the room. Selina felt her breath hitch, a strange tightness in her chest that she had not prepared for. There was no anger in Sophie's eyes, no accusation. Just something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Selina swallowed hard, shifting slightly in her seat, resisting the instinct to look away. The music swelled once more, the final notes cascading into a moment of perfect silence before fading into the vastness of the room. The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that filled every inch of the hall, but Sophie did not immediately rise from her seat. She remained there, fingertips still resting on the keys, taking it all in. Then, finally, she stood, stepping forward to take her bow. From where he stood just beyond the curtain, Nathan Carter watched his daughter with a pride so fierce it bordered on something else entirely. For so long, he had carried the unbearable weight of knowing that he could protect her from so many things, but not from the world itself. Not from the people who looked at her and saw something she was not, who decided she was guilty before she ever had a chance to speak. He had wanted to fix it, to make it right, but he had learned that there were some battles even a man like him could not fight. Sophie had fought this one on her own, and she had won. She descended the stage slowly, the applause still ringing in her ears as she moved toward the waiting arms of her father. He pulled her in without a word, his grip firm, grounding, a silent reassurance that whatever came next, she would never face it alone. From the far end of the room, Selina Harper watched the scene unfold. She had already started to rise from her seat, already turned toward the exit, when something made her pause. Sophie had turned, looking in her direction once more. There was no nod this time, no lingering moment stretched between them like before. Just the faintest shift in Sophie's posture, the smallest recognition that she saw her. And somehow, that was enough. Selina exhaled, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Without another glance, she stepped out into the night, disappearing into the quiet hum of the city. This story is a powerful exploration of redemption, resilience, and the long, difficult road toward understanding. At its core, it is not just about crime, corruption, or justice. It is about people, the choices they make, and the weight of those choices on their souls. Sophie Carter's journey is one of quiet strength. From the moment she was humiliated and stripped of her dignity, she refused to be broken. Instead of letting anger consume her, she transformed her pain into something meaningful, her music. She represents the unyielding spirit of those who have been wronged, yet choose to rise above their suffering, proving that true strength is not in revenge, but in perseverance. Selina Harper, on the other hand, embodies the painful realization of one's own prejudice and mistakes. Her redemption arc is striking because it does not come easily. She loses everything, her badge, her reputation, but gains something far greater, self-awareness, and the chance to truly change. The story teaches us that forgiveness is not always immediate, nor is it guaranteed. However, the willingness to change, to acknowledge one's failures, and to do better, that is where true redemption lies. It is a deeply human tale, reminding us that while we cannot erase the past, we can always shape the future. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.